4, 3, 2, 1, start broadcast.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the PRSA Assembly Delegate webinar that's scheduled for today. This is the second of 4 that we have to review 6 bylaw proposals. My name is Tony D'Angelo. I am the 2018 chair of PRSA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and run you through what is our agenda for today, as well as for the succeeding calls, to give all of our delegates an opportunity to get full information and have an opportunity to ask questions about 6 bylaw proposals that are before us. So let me ask headquarters. I'm not able to see any slides right now. Are they up on the screen?
Look at the slide. Yes, they are.
Click the slide.
Yeah, it should be.
Did you share the screen?
Here you go.
You share the screen.
Oh, you're not. You're sharing. There we go.
You should see it now.
I don't.
Slide?
I do not. I see for PRSA headquarters, I'm seeing a PRSA logo.
You got it.
Hang on just a minute. Please bear with us while we deal with this technical difficulty. And if everyone else is seeing the slides.
I'm not, Tony.
Okay, thank you.
I'm seeing them.
Well, aren't you special?
Yeah, I guess so. So sorry.
Hey, I'm with Mary Beth on this one. I see them too.
I see them too.
Okay.
So it's just some of you.
Yes.
The options.
Okay, it just came up. I now have the format and schedule of webinars slide up. So sorry, everyone, for that delay. So today we are going to address bylaw proposals 1801 and 1806. On Monday, just to remind everyone, we're going to go through 1804 and 1805. The time of these webinars is 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern each day. Each of these webinars is going to be recorded, so you can have later access to it. We will have, as you'll see in a moment, time for Q&A on each of the proposals, and the staff, board, and governance committee will post the answers to any questions that we don't get to live on these calls in the delegate forum and the feedback PRSA forum. So let me go on to the format for today's call and how we'll spend our hour together. After this brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to the governance committee chaired by Jessica Graham, who will have 10 minutes to outline what the proposal is, the actual text of the proposed bylaw amendment, and the rationale for why it's being proposed. That will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and then it will go back to Jessica for a wrap-up, a summation of 5 minutes. At that time, it'll come back to me, and I will introduce Susan Hart and Mary Beth West, who are the co-authors of Proposal 1806. In exactly like fashion, they will describe the proposal itself and the rationale. The governance committee, that is Jessica, will describe for 5 minutes why the governance committee and the board have not endorsed that proposal before we'll go into 15 minutes of Q&A. And then Susan and Mary Beth will return after the Q&A to do their 5-minute wrap-up. So that's the format for today's call. And our presenters, as I have mentioned briefly, and a couple other guests that we have, are Jessica Graham, APR, who is our governance committee chair, and Susan Hart, APR fellow PRSA, and Mary Beth West, APR fellow who are the co-authors of 4 proposals that they will review on today's call. In addition to that, we have our parliamentarian and legal counsel. All the proposals that you're going to see today have been vetted by Barry Glazier, who many of you may recognize as he has been our parliamentarian for the last several assemblies at least. So he's very familiar with PRSA's bylaws and how our assembly works, and he's provided his consulting service. He's there to keep us on track from a parliamentary procedure point of view. And Ashley Allione from Venable LLP is there as our legal counsel. We are incorporated in the state of New York and are therefore beholden to New York State statutory law. Ashley and her colleagues at Venable make sure that we're following the laws. So, and they're on hand to answer any questions should you have any. With that, I'd like to introduce Jessica Graham to introduce the first proposal. Jessica?
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of these calls. I know we have a lot of bylaws coming before you this year and some really complicated issues, so I appreciate your taking the time to listen and hear both sides of the proposals. I'm going to start with Proposal 1801, which is our recommended bylaw regarding a member in good standing. You can see before you on the slide current language. It's relatively vague. It basically says that a member needs to follow our bylaws, our policies and procedures, and pay dues, or otherwise not cause harm to the society. And the board came to the governance committee in spring of this year, and they had been in consultation with legal counsel about several issues that had come up over the previous year and a half. And it was legal counsel's opinion that PRSA had some vulnerability with regard to those issues, that our bylaws were not specific enough with regard to member in good standing, and even perhaps a grievance procedure. And so the governance committee took a look at this issue. We did some best practices research with other similar societies and have come back to you with the recommended language that you'll see on the next slide. As you can see, we are suggesting that the board or its designee that the board or its designee will determine a member who is not in good standing, and that will be based on a member's adherence to our bylaws, our policies and procedures, our code of ethics, of course, dues, any financial obligations, and that we also expect members in good standing will work collaboratively and civilly to strengthen the society, and will not engage in any behaviors or activities that put the society in jeopardy or that will bring discredit to the society or its members or the profession of public relations. And again, our reason behind this is that we felt we needed more specific language to help the society in instances of members not adhering to what we consider acceptable behavior. And just to throw a couple of current news examples out at you, if you think of the Me Too movement, or if you think on online cyberbullying, nothing in the previous bylaws addressed those issues in any way. And obviously, there's unacceptable behavior in that. And so we wanted to give a basis and a more specific definition to what a member in good standing might be. Now, having said that, we absolutely want to continue to welcome discussion, debate, criticism at the society. We absolutely want to continue an open dialogue with any issues or complaints that might be brought forward to our attention. That's really not the purpose of this. We don't want to quell that in any way. Our objective goes well beyond that. We've also had some questions about what we mean by discredit. And specifically in this instance, we mean harming the reputation of someone or something, in this case being PRSA or our public relations profession. And with that overview, I will be happy to open it up and answer any questions that you may have about 1801.
Okay, Michael, I am not seeing the feed of questions that's coming in. So if you can, perhaps you could tee those up if there are any in queue.
This is Jessica. I can jump in and one, if headquarters, you could go back to the previous slide. We have a request to see that again. Thank you. And Nancy is asking if the slides will be shared. And yes, they'll be posted with the recording. Is that correct?
That is correct. Hopefully tomorrow.
Thank you.
Tony, can I ask a point of order question?
Sure.
In this morning's webinar, I think there was some inconsistency as to whether or not the people asking questions were identified. And we've been asked to make sure that there is a consistency, either not revealing the people's names or revealing the people's names, but just be consistent.
I'm fine either way, certainly.
I would say in the interest of disclosure and transparency that the names be shared.
Okay. All right. Do we have other questions?
Tony, this is Jessica again. I see one on the chat from Margaret. Margaret, I'm going to butcher your last name, Rich, I believe. The question is, how will the bylaw be enforced? So this bylaw, 1801, sets the groundwork for our recommended bylaw number 1802, which sets forth a grievance procedure for PRSA. It's a multi-tiered procedure to ensure that the issues are of substance. And we will get into that detail much more deeply on a later call. But that's the avenue that we are providing by which this bylaw would be enforced.
I don't see, right now, Tony, we don't see any other questions coming in through the Q&A box.
Okay.
I see another question on the chat panel from Aaron Rolfs. And Aaron, again, apologies if I'm butchering your last name. Is there a concern for this bylaw passing and 1802 not passing? Aaron, that is certainly a possibility. I know the governance committee feels very good about both bylaws and does believe that they are in the best interest of PRSA. But certainly that is a possibility. And if that's the case, then I think the governance committee would be tasked to next year taking feedback and trying to put forth a revision on a grievance procedure for the following year. And there's another question from Kathy Morley Foster that asking about language that explains who or how or who would determine whether someone complies. And again, Kathy, the way we are addressing that is by putting forth a proposal for a grievance procedure that, again, goes into great detail on how complaints would be filed and how those complaints would go through the system. And by the way, there is an appeal process. We've been very careful to make sure that the process that we are recommending follows due process.
And Jessica, if I could add to that, I think a number of questions that we've had previously, in conversations and even the previous webinars that we've had, has to do with really what part of governance is addressed at the bylaw level, which is the foundational level, and what is more a matter addressed at the policy and procedure level, which is more flexible, and where one can get into details of how bylaws are enacted and who has responsibility and what steps are there, what timelines are there, what appeals processes are there. And I think it's accurate to say that we've received guidance from both the parliamentarian and legal counsel that the essential building block for what could become a grievance policy is to have a clear definition of a member in good standing and what constitutes that. So that's where 1801 is coming from. Keep me honest here, Jessica. That's how I define it in my own mind anyway.
No, I agree.
Tony, we do have a question. Sandy said she logged in late. She wants to know if we can go back and please post the text of the amendment being discussed. So we're just going to go back one or two slides so Sandy can see the text.
Sure.
Jessica, Kathy Morley Foster has another question regarding this proposal.
You beat me to it. Kathy's asking if we don't need to reference 1802 in the recommendation of 1801. Barry, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. 1801 is, I don't think, is dependent on 1802. Again, it's a bylaw that sets our expectation. So I think we're fine having them separate.
Glazer here. Yeah, there'd be two problems with the cross-reference. The most obvious problem is that if the other one doesn't get adopted, you've made a cross-reference to something that doesn't exist, and that would make it meaningless. And the second point is, as she said, if this one is adopted and the grievance process is not adopted, then likely the grievance process would fall to a policy until a appropriate bylaw could be adopted if necessary.
Are there any other questions that have come in?
Connie. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Connie Crowther, and again, apologies for these last names if I'm destroying them, is asking, since 1801 and 1802 are directly related, suggest we should review and discuss them together. Connie, the reason that and we can certainly take that recommendation at assembly, but the reason the calls were set up as they are is, in addition to the grievance procedure that the governance committee is recommending, which is 1802, Mary Beth West and Susan Hart, have also proposed a procedure. And so we thought it made the most sense to discuss our procedure at the same time we discussed their procedure, since approving them both is not an option. So that's why we set up the calls the way that we did. You're very welcome.
Okay, Tony, we don't see any other questions in the Q&A box.
Okay. Is anything come through in chat? We'll give people a few more seconds if they'd like to register additional questions. Okay. So hearing none, we can ask Jessica to proceed to her wrap-up.
Sure, I'll be happy to. And again, thank you for the great questions and dialogue. Really appreciate your engagement. Again, the board came to the governance committee in the spring after consultation with the attorney and followed recommendations that we
I had it right.
exposed some vulnerabilities that the society had with regard to some member activity. And so we put forth a recommendation for Bylaw 1801 that further defines a member in good standing. We tried to specifically include behavior that the society would deem inappropriate. We welcome, as always, open discussion, debate, and criticism directed at and about PRSA. This is not what this bylaw amendment is about. We want to be able to protect our society and protect our members. We appreciate your input and thoughts, and we look forward to seeing you at Assembly as we formally present Proposal 1801 for your vote and consideration. Thank you.
All right, 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. With that, we will proceed into a presentation on Proposal 1806, which is to add the word nonpartisan to PRSA's bylaws in terms of purpose and limitations. And the co-authors of that proposal will present that, and they are, as I mentioned previously, Susan Hart, APR Fellow PRSA, and Mary Beth West, APR Fellow PRSA. And I believe Susan will start. Susan?
Yes, thanks, Tony. And thanks to everyone for joining us on today's call to learn more about our efforts toward ethics reform. It is the case, I'm sorry,
Could others mute their line, please? Thank you. Go ahead, Susan.
Thank you. It is the case that we secured PRSA member petition support for Amendment 1806 to add nonpartisan to PRSA's statement of purpose. Next slide. And today we will provide an overview of proposed bylaw language. Like many organizations in today's environment, PRSA is at a very pivotal point where a critical decision needs to be made on whether or not it wants to stay true to its longtime stance of nonpartisanship. Unfortunately, in recent years, leadership has shown a pattern of partisan-leaning communications and without any strategy. As a result, PRSA has often veered into partisan-leaning territory, real or perceived, in tactical ways that are often knee-jerk and, quite frankly, embarrassing. Because nonpartisan is not codified in our bylaws, there has been no accountability to a nonpartisan ethic. And so it's clear there will not and cannot be accountability to nonpartisanship until we amend bylaws. Next slide. Here is the current bylaw language, and the next slide shows that what we are recommending is a single statement that says the society shall operate and communicate as a nonpartisan organization. Next slide. Among our points for this change, nonpartisanship has been a part of PRSA's tradition for decades. As I mentioned in the recent past, PRSA has distributed a steady crescendo of consistently slanted, partisan-leaning communications, real or perceived. And worse, leadership lacks a consistent standard for how it publicly criticizes or celebrates anything political, and that inconsistency is a problem for our brand, among other concerns. Next slide. Let's take a look at some partisan examples that point to the need to codify nonpartisan in our bylaws. Next slide. From 2009 to 2016, PRSA did not issue one single statement about ethical breaches or inaccuracies by any national political figures, and there wasn't a single complaint with that posture to stay out of partisan politics and focus rather on our mission to help our members grow in their PR careers. Next slide. We have one exception. In 2009, PRSA gave its National PR Professional of the Year award to Obama Campaign Communications Director Robert Gibbs. To some, this action may have appeared to be an endorsement, particularly given PRSA's gushing language about Mr. Gibbs in its news release. But again, despite appearances, no one complained, including us. I'll now turn it over to Mary Beth.
Thanks so much, Susan. So let's fast forward to 2016. If we could go to the next slide, please. In what may have been the most divisive presidential election year of modern times, a sitting PRSA national officer, not just board member, but officer, chose to use their own social media feeds, also used for their PRSA-related commenting and national following base, including PRSSA students, and thought that it would be appropriate to post their own political comments such as you see here. This is only a partial showing, incidentally. We saw dozens of time-stamped comments very similar to these on Twitter alone. Some people say that because this was personal commenting by a sitting PRSA national officer and not using PRSA's official Twitter handle, it doesn't count as partisan. Next slide. But PRSA's own social media policy states otherwise. Personal use of social media by PRSA leaders is actionable if a leader's commentary reflects poorly on PRSA. It says so in the policy. Despite this policy, though, this national officer's partisan and even distasteful comments got a free pass. This inflammatory social media commenting put Susan and me on high alert because only months later, in January 2017, this same national officer appointed themselves as chair of PRSA's Advocacy Committee, which placed them squarely in charge of writing and issuing all of PRSA's public-facing advocacy statements on behalf of the entire 21,000-member organization. Next slide. This lack of compliance to a nonpartisan ethic and blatant disregard for PRSA's own policies set the stage later for PRSA leadership to be emboldened to make comments calling out specific political personalities by name, such as you see here. Next slide. Leadership then took its message out on the road in local and regional speaking engagements where attendees' social media comments reflected the politically partisan tenor of commenting being put forth under the PRSA banner. Next slide. This precedent has now continued in 2018, with PRSA placing on its own news site a whole host of admonishing call-outs, often in regard to political issues. Clearly, trade media and third-party organizations perceive PRSA as, in this case, blasting political staff. But by default, PRSA has now unwittingly aligned what we as PRSA members do as being somehow comparable to what these other individuals do. That's also a problem. Next slide. Another case from 2017 involved a public relations graduate program, USC Annenberg, which we later learned was a $30,000 sponsor of PRSA, which PRSA earlier failed to disclose. Last summer, Annenberg wanted to field an anti-White House survey of PR professionals. They asked PRSA to help procure sample by pushing out an open internet survey link that Annenberg had thrown out on social media with provocative and rather baiting language. As you can see here, PRSA complied. Next slide. This is an example of some of the language Annenberg used to promote survey participation on a separate website. Annenberg promised ahead of time that the results would be, quote, interesting and provocative. Incidentally, I know a colleague in California who took this survey and was able to take it 10 times and even gave it to her middle school age nephew to take. So in short, very slipshod methodology. Next slide. Once the survey results were in and revealed, to no one's surprise at all kinds of unflattering things about White House staff by name, PRSA promoted those results as well, and again, without disclosing the $30,000 Annenberg sponsorship to PRSA. Next slide. Later, when I asked if PRSA would allow for any kind of follow-up article to correct the record about the survey methodology, PRSA Publications responded, presumably in defense of their $30,000 sponsor, indicating, quote, this is not a topic we want to address in PRSA Publications, end quote. Next slide. So even if you look past the troubling partisanship of that episode, let's not forget that PRSA appeared out of compliance with its own ethics code by not disclosing the sponsorship and promoting the survey. Our protests of this issue were met by leadership with a fairly nonchalant reply of, oh, we'll just try to tighten up our policy in the future, all the while insisting that, quote, PRSA is nonpartisan and always has been, which at that point felt tantamount to being told false information. Next slide. Some months later, though, PRSA's own Board of Ethics and Professional Standards issued recommendations to the board, specifically tied to ethics and partisanship issues that we voiced about this incident. BEPS advised leadership to undertake proper disclosures concerning social media activity and better vetting and disclosure processes tied to advocacy statements and third-party research. to avoid partisanship and other problems. Next slide. Despite the BEPS memo, leadership's new advocacy process decision-making chart issued in October 2017 does not even mention perceived partisanship as being a criteria point for PRSA to vet issues and statements. It's as if the BEPS memo advising against partisanship never occurred. The board also never disclosed the BEPS memo in its 2017 meeting minutes. So, business as usual. Next slide. We urge approval of this bylaw proposal, and it should be noted that it does not affect PRSA's tax status, ability to advocate for our profession in any way, or really any of what we feel are unfounded concerns voiced by leadership. I will not read this entire former PRSA member's letter, but hope that you will review it later. Like this gentleman states here in his reference to the Hatch Act and other concerns, we will see more valued members turning away from PRSA affiliation for valid reasons if we don't adopt nonpartisanship to our bylaws and get away from partisan grandstanding or that which can be perceived as such. We really appreciate everyone hearing our proposal, and I turn the question now over back to Chair D'Angelo.
Okay, thank you, Mary Beth. So, if we could have the next slide, please. I'd like to turn it back to Jessica, who will now explain the Governance Committee's rationale for not endorsing Proposal 1806. Jessica?
Thank you, Tony. The Governance Committee spent quite a while debating this issue and talking through the implications. And first and foremost, I want to say that we were unanimous in that we believe PRSA is a nonpartisan organization and should remain that way. We feel very strongly, and I think everybody's aligned, that we should be nonpartisan. However, we think adding nonpartisan specifically to our bylaws is quite problematic, particularly in today's political climate. If you look at almost any issue in which PRSA would advocate for or against, any of those would be partisan. And just being as simple as we possibly can, if a Democrat put forth a proposed bill that we thought would be damaging to PR professionals or our industry, we could choose to advocate against that bill. And that's part of our mission. We advocate on behalf of our profession. Very important to be able to do that. And while we would certainly not be endorsing any candidate or any political doctrine, one could argue that we were arguing against the Democratic platform in this example. And our opinion is, in today's political climate particularly, putting such language in the bylaws could be used to make these kinds of arguments and could prove to limit our ability to advocate. Again, as a 501c6 organization, we do have the ability and the responsibility to lobby on behalf of our profession, if needed. Now, having said that, our legal counsel did note that PRSA does not contribute funds to candidates, does not contribute funds to political parties, or to other political groups in the United States on both the federal and state levels, and nor does it allow its facilities or resources to be used by candidates, political parties, or other political groups to benefit any campaign or election efforts. It's also worth noting that counsel pointed out that including nonpartisan in our bylaws would not, at the end of the day, have any impact on a leader's ability to post personal opinions in personal social media channels. Now, during review of this proposal, the Governance Committee did suggest multiple potential compromises to Mary Beth and Susan to ensure that PRSA could remain nonpartisan without adding the suggested language to our bylaws. Our suggestions including adding the verbiage to our policies and procedures, which is really the document that guides us day to day on all of the processes behind the bylaws. We offered to add the verbiage to the guidelines and charter for PRSA's advocacy committee, and we suggested updating PRSA's social media policy. And these suggestions were declined by the proposal sponsors. the end of the day, we worry about who is going to decide what is partisan and what is not, particularly in today's political climate. While the rationale did include a dictionary definition of what nonpartisan means, it's going to be very challenging to draw that line again in today's political climate. It is very important to governance, and I believe the board, that PRSA remain nonpartisan. But we strongly feel that that word would be much more effectively implemented in our policies and procedures in other areas that we've identified. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Now we'll move into 15 minutes of question and answer. So I would ask the PRSA staff and Jessica to please monitor the question queue and the chat box.
We have a question from Elizabeth Jamel. She's asking, will this proposal limit PRSA's ability to advocate for our members, and who is going to define what is or isn't partisan?
Oops, sorry, I was on mute. I would not anticipate that this would in any way hinder our ability to advocate for the profession. The only thing that it would place any limitations on are what would be perceived to be overt partisan comments or partisan leanings. It's very important to note that at the advocacy committee, from any information that we've ever been able to gather, whether it's through national board meeting minutes or any other venue, the website, what have you, we've not seen any strategy articulated around advocacy. It appears that they only tend to respond most often to politically tinged questions or overtly political subject matter, which immediately lands us into this realm of being in this risky place where any comments that are put forward can easily be interpreted in that manner. Now, I would not anticipate that this would stop us at all from talking about ethics in general, putting forth best practices, spotlighting our Silver Anvil case study, Silver Anvil Award winners and case studies as best practices, etc. So I would anticipate there would be absolutely no bearing on that.
We have a question from Heather Kavanaugh. Heather, apologies if I'm not getting the name right. Please help me understand why you wouldn't accept the idea of bipartisanship being addressed in policies rather than bylaws.
Well, clearly PRSA leadership has a trouble sometimes following policies. There was a social media policy as I went through, I recognize we went through it quickly, that was not adhered to in our view. There have been other issues in that regard that I did not have time to go into today, but simply placing it in policies and procedures was an issue too, because leadership does not share its policies and procedures with members. Last year, when the board decided to take down all of its board meeting minutes off of its website, and I asked for the policy that was dictating that, they said it was now confidential information and it couldn't be shared anymore. I asked for the policy for that, and I was told in writing, and I have it in writing, where leadership said policies are confidential information just as the minutes are confidential information. So you see, that presents kind of a problem when you're seeking out some transparency as to how PRSA volunteer leadership will conduct business and make decisions when we're not even able to see what the rules of the road are. And for that reason, we felt like having it in bylaws was something that was more solidified. If leadership wants to change the policies and procedures, we're not stopping them from doing that. We welcome them to do that. But for that to be the only fail-safe answer to this was not acceptable to us based on prior experience.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Amelia Folks. Even if the committee's suggestions were declined, why has not those options been brought forth as separate amendments? She feels strongly that an updated social media policy needs to be implemented at minimum. Same with regard to our policies and advocacy committees. Amelia, I can answer that. Again, this is Jessica. The governance committee agrees with you. And once we get through assembly, we have already talked to headquarters and our legal counsel about doing a thorough review of all of our policies and procedures, including the social media policy. So we agree. We think that needs to be updated as well. So that is on our radar to address once we get through the assembly.
I also see Amelia's question here that says that it sounds like most of the partisanship issues were conducted by a former board member. Could it be seen only as an issue with this particular person? Actually, this person is still on the board.
Can I also address that as well?
Sure.
This was not an action that was done by a single individual. There is an executive committee of the board. In my opinion, the board is the board as a leadership entity. So, actions that may have been taken last year, 2 years ago, whatever, the board is still responsible.
Also, I had seen a separate question. I think it kind of reiterates what was stated earlier. Please explain why you declined the alternatives presented by leadership. And that does speak a little bit to what we covered earlier. But just wanted to be sure that it was clear that really the only alternative that we had, apart from putting it in bylaws, was to not present it as a bylaw proposal at all. And we will discuss that here in just a moment in our wrap up.
Do we have other questions that have come in?
There's one from Christopher Perez. If any political party is standing in the way of PRSA promoting open communication, we should stand against that point of view. Wouldn't adding the word nonpartisan limit this ability?
No, I don't think it would at all. And let's get back to the main point here is that what we're trying to do is add a sentence that reflects the organization's practice for decades. That's really it. We're not about the task of implementation with putting forward this proposal. That implementation can be reflected in the policies and procedures. It can be reflected in the advocacy charter of the advocacy committee, perhaps the governance committee. We're not into the details of how partisanship is going to be determined, and he said this, but then she said this, and is it consistent, and is there equitable blame to go all around? That's really not the issue here. The issue here is to solidify PRSA's longtime stance as nonpartisan, and basically to stay neutral as we have successfully done for decades. And can I add one more thing? And one of the reasons why we want to codify this in the bylaws is that, for lack of a better term, in recent years there has been some unsupervised activity that called into question our commitment to that stance.
Also, I see a question here from Kim Keeler asking for clarification, saying the board declined providing their meeting minutes, ? Were they in executive session? The answer is no. Last year in early August, when all of the board minutes were deleted from the website, and that means every set of board minutes from every previous year, including last year, were all deleted all at one time. It wasn't just portions of minutes that were in executive session. It was all of them. It required quite a bit of effort to try to restore those back. For mostly the month of August. And Tony, you may want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the board minutes, as Mary Beth had indicated, had been posted, and those for a period of years, and I don't know the exact date, but I'm going to say on the order of about 5 years, the quarterly or more or less quarterly in-person meetings of the board, those minutes had been posted. In the summer, at some point in the summer of 2017, it was actually the governance committee came to us and said, there is a policy and procedure that says those minutes will not be posted. So the board, with the best of intentions, was in violation of a policy and procedure. So when we found that out, the board said, okay, we'll take those minutes down. And at our next board meeting, we simply voted to say we definitely want those up. And we took the additional step of not only posting the quarterly board meeting minutes, but we went beyond that. And now we actually post the minutes of our more or less monthly conference calls as well. So that was the only reason.
I have another question from Kirsten Schultz. Kirsten, thank you for the phonetic spelling. If our bylaws state the organization has to communicate and operate as a nonpartisan organization, how does this impact those members who work for partisan organizations? I'm concerned whether this will mean our partisan employees won't be able to serve in leadership roles. Where are the boundaries for this bylaw change?
There are no boundaries for that. I mean, that would not dictate at all someone's employment affiliation. There are nonpartisan organizations, hundreds if not thousands of them in the nation, that advocate for their members, that issue public statements about topics that are in their areas or arenas of expertise all the time. But who maintain nonpartisanship, even if they're lobbying on behalf of their members. That occurs fairly routinely. So it is a matter of just establishing some transparent and well communicated to our members and to leadership policies and procedures as to how that will be carried out, across the course of society operations. I don't believe that it's that difficult an undertaking. Many other organizations accomplish it quite successfully. And I would not anticipate that anyone working for either a partisan organization or a nonpartisan organization, it would impact them in the least.
Tony, we have another question from Connie Crowther. How many members have resigned citing perceived partisan references or advocacy?
I don't know the answer to that. There was one gentleman that Mary Beth had shown that slide who said that he felt that PRSA had become inappropriately partisan and that he was no longer comfortable affiliating with its stance. He had sent me an email saying that he had that concern. And I called him and left him a message saying, I'd be happy to talk about your perspective and give you the information that I have. And I'd never heard back from him on that. So I don't know of others who have up and quit. I will tell you that particular gentleman, his criticism of me, which he sent in a personal email, was that PRSA was hypocritical because it did not go far enough in criticizing Hope Hicks. By the way, my criticism was I didn't criticize Hope Hicks at all. That was not the nature of my post. A headline writer took a different view on that. So, I can tell you as PRSA's chair that any advocacy statement that I have offered, some people, and this is the political climate that we're in, let's understand that PRSA is a microcosm now of a national and social dialogue that's happening. Almost any statement can be perceived as partisan. And I have certainly had my share of critics on both sides of the aisle for any advocacy statement. What we have right now is we do have a system in place. We have an advocacy committee led by an advocacy chair. His name is Keith Trivett, and they debate which issues are worthy of PRSA comment, as does our board. So there is a process in place for vetting those. And I can tell you with some assurance that no matter what the statement is, there are complaints. And part of our view is that we feel that we're a learning organization, and it's the ensuing dialogue that people can learn from. So we really want to have an open, honest, respectful debate about public issues so that we can learn from those things. And that's the stance that our board believes and that I believe personally PRSA should take.
If I could also interject, the gentleman who sent that letter also indicated he had sent a letter of concern last year after the alternative facts statement, but it was he told me it was in the spring, so I think that it may have been in the March or April timeframe. I'm a little unsure. And he said that he received no response back to that. And of course, Tony, that was prior to your serving as chair. So at any rate, I think that he had made efforts previously to try to get some answers or get some resolution to it and did not feel that he had been successful with that.
We have
about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure we have time for any more questions at this point. So I believe at this time we go into the summary statement.
Tony, can I ask a question about the questions? For those people who didn't have an opportunity to ask their questions on this forum, what is their option to ask the questions, especially for us who have to provide the answers? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I'm not sure. What we said at the top of the call is anybody who posts a question who is participating in this will answer that by posting answers on both the delegate forum and the feedback PRSA forum.
Right. So are questions that are directed to our proposal, are we going to get those questions so that we can respond?
Yes, because you have access to both those forums.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So with that, let me ask you to please move into your summary statement, Susan and Mary Beth.
Thanks, Tony. We do have some closing comments that are really more focused on leadership's rationales not to endorse our bylaw proposal. And while we respect everyone's opinion, those opinions really need to be accurate and factually based. Unfortunately, that has not been the case with recent information from leadership in their opposition to our proposal. Next slide. Leadership has issued 2 reiterations of rationales not to endorse. The first was on my PRSA, where Chair D'Angelo said last month that the board couldn't support nonpartisanship because they just didn't understand what nonpartisanship meant, implying that we didn't provide a definition. Not true. We did provide a definition, and a very specific one. Next slide. And here is that definition in highlight. So the argument not to endorse because they had no definition just doesn't stand up to the facts. It doesn't stand up to the truth of the matter. In full disclosure, however, the chair did agree weeks later to correct the record. Next slide. Another example of inconsistency. Last month, Chair D'Angelo said PRSA must be nonpartisan, echoing his comments to us earlier this year that PRSA had to be nonpartisan as part of our governance and policy duties. He repeated his support of nonpartisanship in media interviews all summer, adding that not being nonpartisan could alienate roughly half our membership, sponsors, and other key stakeholders. The 2017 chair also supported nonpartisan, stating that PRSA must remain nonpartisan as we serve thousands of people who span the gamut of political ideologies. Next slide. Then leadership reversed positions, decided not to support our proposal because formally codifying such a stance and actually saying that we're nonpartisan or that we hold ourselves to an actual standard could be, quote, potentially dangerous. Considering PRSA's latest financials showing a 6-figure operating loss, we find the reversal of positions to be potentially dangerous to the organization's cash flow, revenue stream, and financial stability. Leadership also said that nonpartisanship was ambiguous. We think it's much more ambiguous when leadership demonstrates partisan actions, claims to be nonpartisan, flip-flops, and then deems nonpartisanship as dangerous, as if the partisan-leaning examples we just shared with you today aren't ambiguous. Next slide. Leadership says it offered a compromise to us. Not true. Their idea of a compromise was for us to withdraw our proposal. Further, suggesting that nonpartisan be addressed in the policies and procedures is inappropriate if for no other reason for the staff and volunteer time involved. Jessica just talked about all of the things on their plate to do. That is going to take an enormous amount of time, probably best measured in years. We're talking about adding one sentence to the bylaws that could take effect immediately. Finally, given leadership's track record in not following its own policies, ironically, from not posting board minutes in a timely method to violating our code of ethics, codifying our proposals via bylaws was the only option that we believe is in the best interest of members. Apparently, leadership is concerned about how nonpartisanship would allegedly create new rules and hurdles and hoops and roadblocks for even the simplest of tasks, like booking a chapter program speaker. Not true. Such a tactic is likely the result of overthinking or fear that adding a statement that reflects PRSA's decades-long position and wholly supported by past and current leadership until recently is somehow problematic. Next slide. Power. We think that's the real bottom line issue. The board has been allowed to make decisions and grant itself much latitude in recent years. And as a result, we believe that leadership is afraid of losing that power because they prefer to have that partisan latitude, whether it's using PRSA as a platform for their personal ideologies or refusing to allow differing viewpoints to be heard, both of which are clear violations of policies and code of ethics. This pattern has continued with no accountability to membership or to the assembly, and that accountability has to be restored, beginning with the codification of nonpartisan in our bylaws. Next slide. As we said earlier, PRSA is at a very pivotal point in its history, and beginning with solidifying its tradition of nonpartisanship and accountability to that provision is an excellent step forward. We urge you to adopt the nonpartisan bylaw proposal 1806 and take back PRSA. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Susan and Mary Beth, and thanks to everyone for joining today's webinar. A reminder that we will reconvene in the same forum on Monday to discuss bylaw proposals 1804 and 1805, and Thursday the 27th to go through 1802 and 1803. I'd like to thank our bylaw authors, our governance committee, our staff, and everyone